Thinking he was just an ordinary old farmer, the cartel snuck onto his land, killed his beloved dog, and even threatened to end his life. However, they didn't realize that the middle-aged man they were intimidating was actually a former Marine sniper who was now hunting them down. On an afternoon in rural Mexico, as Rosa was preparing a meal, her phone suddenly rang. The caller was her brother, Carlos. On the line, sounding panicked, Carlos explained that a cartel was actively hunting him down because he had stolen a large sum of money from them. In a state of desperation and fear, Carlos begged Rosa to take all the cash he had hidden and flee Mexico immediately before it was too late. Shortly after the call ended, the cartel managed to capture Carlos. Their ruthless leader, Mauricio, checked Carlos's phone and saw Rosa's name prominently displayed as one of the last contacts he had called. That was enough to convince Mauricio that she definitely knew the location of the stolen money. Without hesitation or mercy, Carlos was executed. Meanwhile, across the border in Arizona, a former Marine named Jim Hanson was living on a dry ranch near the US-Mexico border. He spent his days tending to his cattle and keeping a close watch over his property. Whenever he saw anyone crossing the border illegally, he always reported them to the Border Patrol officers.
Hey Pete, this is Jim Hanson. About a half-mile from the fence. Over.
Meanwhile, Rosa and her son, Miguel, kept running across the countryside. Long story short, the next day they arrived at an area near the US-Mexico border wall. As a cartel vehicle rapidly approached, they spotted a narrow gap in the tall steel fence and tried to squeeze through before the cartel members arrived. At the same time, Jim, who happened to be nearby, was startled to see a woman and a young boy trying to push their way through the gap in the fence. Rosa's face filled with panic when she realized someone had caught them. Desperate, she begged Jim not to report them to the Border Patrol.
Please, sir, no. Sir, please, no border.
However, before that conversation could end, Mauricio and his men arrived at the scene. Mauricio immediately demanded that Jim hand the woman and the boy over to him.
I come here to take the woman and the boy.
But seeing the guns in their hands, Jim realized that Rosa and Miguel were in grave danger and needed help. Forced into a corner, Jim made the bold decision to fight back, even though he was completely alone. Jim managed to shoot one of the attackers and sped away in his truck, taking Rosa and Miguel with him. Mauricio and his men gave chase with everything they had. As they pulled close, Mauricio quickly climbed onto the truck and tried to take control of the vehicle. Fortunately, Jim managed to knock him off and quickly drove away, leaving the cartel group behind. As they continued their escape, Jim realized something was wrong. Rosa had been shot. With the last of her strength, Rosa handed Jim a slip of paper containing an address along with a dress belonging to a relative. She begged Jim to take Miguel there, warning him never to let Miguel fall into the cartel's hands, because if they found the boy, they would certainly kill him. After speaking those final words, Rosa took her last breath.
Mama!
That night, police and paramedics quickly arrived at the location, including Sarah, Jim's stepdaughter. Having learned what happened, Sarah advised Jim that Miguel should stay at the border station for his own safety, and that he would be sent to an orphanage the following morning. The next morning, Jim woke up inside his truck, parked near the border checkpoint. His dog, Jackson, was lying beside him. Not far away, Jim suddenly spotted a vehicle identical to the one the cartel members had used the previous day. Inside his truck, Jim found a bag left behind by Rosa. Opening it, he discovered it was packed with a substantial amount of cash. Looking at the blood-stained cloth bag, Jim briefly considered using the money to pay off his late wife's debts. However, that thought quickly vanished when Rosa's face flashed across his mind. The money was now a promise, a solemn commitment to honor Rosa's final plea, trusting him as a protector who could shield her son from the cartel. Reminded of her last wish, Jim started his engine and headed toward the police station to find Miguel. When Jim walked into the border facility to check on Miguel, an officer informed him that Miguel was being handed over to people claiming to be his family from Mexico. But Jim sensed that something was off. Sure enough, looking out the window, Jim immediately recognized the faces of several men waiting in a car outside. Remaining calm, Jim asked the officer for permission to speak with Miguel for just a few minutes. Once granted, Jim acted fast. He guided Miguel down the hallway, slipped out through a side door, and the two quickly left the premises, beginning their escape for a second time. Mauricio, who noticed this from the parking lot, could only stand in silence as he watched Jim's vehicle speed away. Roaring with anger, he immediately planned to cross into the United States to track them down. and kill them both. Upon arriving back at his Arizona ranch, Jim stopped briefly to pack clothes, weapons, and his remaining cash. However, when he returned to his truck, he was shocked to find that Miguel was gone. The boy had run off, believing Jim was a bad guy. At the exact same time, Mauricio and his men were preparing to cross the border illegally. A border patrol officer spotted them and knew right away that they were cartel members. However, after taking a bribe, the officer reluctantly let them pass without resistance. Meanwhile, not far from the ranch, Jim finally caught up with Miguel. He sternly warned the boy that the cartel would kill him without mercy if he were caught. Left with no choice, Miguel finally complied, and they resumed their journey toward Chicago. Meanwhile, Mauricio and his crew successfully entered the United States and immediately headed to Jim's property. They broke in and ransacked every room until they uncovered several receipts and an old Marine Corps badge. That was the moment the truth was revealed. Jim was no ordinary rancher, but a former Marine, skilled in combat tactics and survival. Mauricio pocketed the badge and ordered his men to burn the house to the ground. Meanwhile, Jim pulled into a gas station to refuel, where he also bought a roadmap to guide their journey to Chicago. However, Jim didn't realize that Mauricio was using his credit card receipts to trace their location by coordinating with other cartel networks operating in the United States. Without wasting any time, Mauricio rushed to the gas station with his men. Upon arrival, he walked up to the clerk, calmly asked about a customer who had recently shopped there, described Jim's appearance, and pressed her to tell him where Jim went. When the woman refused to help, citing privacy, Mauricio grew irritated. Without hesitation, he intimidated her, pulled out his gun, and brutally shot her before leaving the scene. After reviewing the security camera footage at the gas station, Mauricio finally found a lead confirming that Jim was traveling east. The next morning, when Jim woke up, he was shocked for the second time to find that Miguel was not in the truck hand. Even Jackson, his beloved dog, was nowhere to be found. Jim's panic instantly dissolved when he saw Miguel returning with Jackson. Miguel had simply stepped away for a moment to buy food. Relieved, Jim fixed his truck, and they hit the road once again. Relying on the map he had bought, Jim drove toward Chicago. However, another credit card payment Jim made to cover auto repair costs allowed Mauricio and his men to easily track his location once more. Without delay, they immediately set off toward the coordinates. On the road, Jim and Miguel were growing closer, but in the middle of their conversation, their peace was abruptly shattered when a police car appeared behind them, flashing its lights and signaling Jim to pull over. The police officer approached Jim, asked for his ID, and inquired about the firearm Jim had with him. Calmly, Jim explained that the weapon was legally registered, offering to show the original documentation as proof of valid ownership and permits. However, the officer seemed suspicious and insisted on taking the gun, while also expressing an intent to interrogate Miguel. Though uncomfortable with the situation, Jim remained cooperative and agreed to be questioned, following the officer's directive to step into the patrol car. Once inside the back seat of the police cruiser, Jim noticed the officer pull out a phone and speak quietly. At that moment, Jim realized this was no ordinary traffic stop. He recognized that the officer was stalling for time, likely coordinating with the cartel. Convinced the officer was corrupt, Jim got out of the car and confronted him, asking how much money he was getting for betraying them. When the officer drew his gun, Jackson suddenly leaped out. And together, they subdued the officer until he was knocked unconscious. They then ran back to the truck and sped off before Mauricio could arrive and capture them. A short while later, Mauricio and his men arrived at the scene, only to be shocked to find the officer lying unconscious on the ground. Mauricio demanded to know where Jim had gone, but the officer couldn't answer, explaining that he was writhing in pain right as Jim drove away. Frustrated and considering the officer a failure, Mauricio killed him on the spot without a shred of empathy. That night, Jim and Miguel checked into a small motel to rest. But in the middle of the night, when Jim woke up and took Jackson outside for some fresh air, he suddenly spotted Mauricio's men on the premises. Panicking slightly, Jim rushed back to the room, quietly woke Miguel, and called the police to report a fake break-in, hoping to create a distraction. He helped Miguel climb out the window, and they quickly moved through the darkness into the bushes to hide. A few moments later, Mauricio and his men burst into the room, only to find it completely empty. Mauricio shouted in anger, declaring that, sooner or later, he would find both Jim and Miguel. Hearing Mauricio's threatening shouts, Jim told Miguel to wait in the truck while he went back to search for Jackson. But shortly after, Jim managed to locate his beloved dog. Jackson, ever protective of his master, barkingly attempted to attack Mauricio. Unfortunately, Mauricio pulled out his gun and fired at Jackson until the dog fell silent and motionless. The following morning, after several hours of driving, they stopped again at a small roadside church. As Miguel was praying, a priest approached Jim and asked if he was Miguel's grandfather. Jim said no, but explained that he was a man who had made a promise to Miguel's mother to keep the boy safe. A short while later, Jim called Sarah again to tell her what was happening. However, Sarah seemed unconcerned about his promise, repeatedly urging her stepfather to bring Miguel back to Arizona because, in her view, the police were the ones who should be responsible for Miguel's safety. Instead of heeding Sarah's request, Jim refused once more. He stated that he would still deliver Miguel to his family in Chicago, willing to face whatever consequences lay ahead just to keep his promise to Rosa. As Jim and Miguel continued their journey toward Chicago, Mauricio and his men were still searching for leads to pinpoint their location. Eventually, they came across the map Jim had left behind earlier. On it, they noticed a red circle drawn over a specific spot, a mark they believed indicated Jim's final destination, Chicago. Wasting no more time, Mauricio immediately contacted his associates living in Chicago, ordering them to be on high alert for when Jim and the boy arrived. Sometime later, Miguel watched Jim practicing his shooting. Seeing Miguel's curiosity, Jim invited him to join in, teaching him how to shoot accurately as well as how to field strip and reassemble the weapon.
We'll slide back to clear it.
After the lesson, Miguel told Jim that when he grew up, he planned to kill Mauricio and all his men to avenge his mother's death. Hearing this, Jim looked at him sternly and told Miguel that taking a life was nothing to be proud of. Jim reminded him that his mother had sacrificed her life so that Miguel could have a better one. That night, Jim and Miguel took shelter under an abandoned overpass to keep warm. They lit a small fire, burning the cartel's cash in place of firewood. Money was no longer the most important thing to them. All that mattered now was surviving.
Then, I get...
The next morning, they finally arrived on the outskirts of Chicago. As he drove down the highway, Jim noticed two suspicious men watching them from an overpass above. Sensing the lurking danger, Jim was forced to veer off the main road and drive through rural routes, hoping to throw the cartel off their trail. However, unexpectedly, the cartel's convoy closed in rapidly from behind.
Get out. Not if I get him.
Moments later, Mauricio recklessly forced his way into a warehouse and managed to capture Miguel. Holding a gun to the boy's head, he ordered Jim to drop his weapon for Miguel's safety.
He's gonna be trained by the best.
Give me the gun. Give me. Wait. Now you have a choice.
Not long after, they arrived at the address written on the slip of paper Rosa had given Jim. When Miguel knocked on the door, his aunt and grandmother greeted him with tearful emotion. When Miguel turned around to say goodbye to Jim, Jim was already gone. Jim was sitting on a bus taking him back home. Resting near the window, he held his wounded torso, exhaling slowly as he closed his eyes. In that moment, Jim felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before, so calm and deeply serene. All of it was for the struggle of keeping a promise to someone he hadn't even known.